Get started in a minute, everyone. Okay. Hello. We'll just give it one more minute before we get started. I hope everyone is having a nice day and a nice week. As nice as we can, given everything going on. Oh, I do want to share a resource with everyone. So let me find where that is and share that before we get started. Okay, here we go. Hello, hi everyone. Before we even get started, I am going to share a link with you. There's a great Jewish learning institute called the Hartman Institute. It's in Jerusalem. They have offices and they do things here in Los Angeles. They sponsor events at synagogues and community-wide learning sessions with their scholars here in LA and all over the world. But right now, starting this week, they created a whole summer, basically a month of incredible learning opportunities. I just put it in the chat so you can go check it out if you haven't already. Some of you may have already learned with Hartman. Some of you may already be signed up for some of the sessions that they have going on right now. But I highly recommend, especially if you enjoy this kind of learning, if you want to take it multiple levels higher, then I highly suggest you sign up for some of the sessions. Luckily for me as a rabbi, there are some that are exclusively for clergy and rabbis, but there are a ton of opportunities out there. So I recommend you go, you look at the schedule, it's free. Of course, you can donate to support them if you want to, but all free opportunities with incredible scholars. I've been trying to do as many of the sessions as I can this week, and I'm going to be doing a bunch of them throughout the month when I can, given my schedule. But I really do recommend you go and check that out. So again, it's the Hartman Institute. You can find them online and then go look at their summer series. You can peruse the agenda and see all the things that are being taught. And you can also then download some of the source sheets so that as you're learning, you can follow along. Anyway, great stuff. So highly recommend that. Hello, thanks for joining me. It's nice to see everyone for our 15th session. Today we are going to continue. Last week we studied a story that referenced a carob tree. We talked about a cave and this man coming out of the cave and what does that look like? And that was the second story of caves that we've looked at so far. And one of the things that is mentioned in that story is that one of the things right outside the cave was a carob tree. So as I was preparing for last week's session, I was remembering all these references to carob trees throughout the Talmud, and it reminded me of this story that I wanted to share with you. It's a very famous story, so many of you may have already heard it before, but even if we've heard these stories, it's always good to engage with them again with fresh eyes, given where we are today. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk today about Honi, the circle maker or the circle drawer, and hear about his story and try and understand what's going on there with this character who only shows up at this part of the Talmud. He doesn't exist anywhere else in the Talmud. It's just in this section of Ta'anit. So before we get into that, let's do the blessing for engaging in the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for giving us the opportunity to engage in the study of Torah together. Amen. As I always do, really quickly to go over how these sessions will run. I'll start, we'll go through, we'll look at the text together, I'll put it on the screen. Once we read through it, then we'll go back and break it down, and I'll offer some of my own interpretations, and then I'll open it up in the chat and for anyone to ask questions or comments and for us to have a discussion as we have every week. So there's always time for that. Okay, so let's get to it. Thank you again for being here. All right, text one. There's only one text today anyway, but let me get it up here. actually, before we do that, Ta'anit is the section, we've actually looked at one other story from Ta'anit, and actually from the page right after this, or page or two after this in the Talmud. Ta'anit is the section of the Talmud that deals with fasts, and deals with all kinds of fast days, and what are the regulations behind those fast days, and also when would we have a fast day. So this is a section that's focusing on rain, and the story that we talked about, actually, it was session 12. The session that we talked about in honor of George Floyd was also from the section of Ta'anit. It was from 24a, and it was about the story of the man who has the fish pond. So for those of you who remember that, or you can go back and look at the source if you want to see another story that comes from the same section. So this is from Ta'anit 23a. Okay, here we go. Our rabbis have taught on Tana'ite authority. What message did the members of the hewn stone chamber, the superior court, send to Honi the circle drawer? You shall also decree something, and it shall be established for you, and light shall shine upon your ways. When they cast you down, you shall say, there is lifting up. For the humble person he saves. He delivers him that is not innocent. Yes, he shall be delivered through the cleanness of your hands. That's from Job. So, you shall also decree something. Means you have decreed below, and the Holy One, blessed be he, carries out your word above. And light shall shine upon your ways. A generation that was shrouded in darkness did you illuminate through your prayer. When they cast you down, you shall say, there is a lifting up. A generation that had sunk down, you lifted up with your prayer. For the humble person he saves. A generation that was humiliated by its sin, you saved by your prayer. He delivers him that is not innocent. A generation that was not innocent, you delivered by your prayer. Yes, he shall be delivered through the cleanness of your hands. You delivered it through the work of your clean hands. Said Rabbi Yochanan, all the rest of the life of that righteous man, he was troubled by this verse of scripture. A song of ascents. When the Lord brought back those that returned to Zion, we were like those who dream. From Psalm 126. Honi thought, is there anyone who sleeps and dreams for 70 years? One day, he was going along the road. He saw a man who was planting a carob tree. He said to him, as to that tree, how long does it take to bear fruit? He said to him, it takes 70 years. He said to him, is it absolutely obvious to you that you are going to live another 70 years? He said to him, that man I found a world full of carobs. Just as my fathers planted for me, so I plant these for my children. He sat down to wrap a piece of bread, and sleep overtook him. As he slept, a rocky formation closed around him and hid him from sight, and he slept for 70 years. When he woke up, he saw a certain man gathering carobs from the tree. He said to him, are you the one who planted the tree? He said to him, I am his grandson. He said to him, it is to be inferred that I have slept for 70 years. He saw his ass who had produced generations of mules, and he went home. He said to them, is the son of Honi the circle drawer still alive? They said to him, his son is no longer, but his grandson is here. He said to them, I am Honi the circle drawer. They didn't believe him. He went to the house of study. He heard the rabbis saying, our traditions are as clear to us as in the days of Honi the circle drawer, for when he would come to the house of study, any question that the rabbis had, he would work out for them. He said to them, I am Honi the circle drawer. They didn't believe him or pay him any respect such as was owing to him. He was deeply hurt. He sought mercy and died. Said Rabbah, that is in line with what people say, either fellowship or death. Okay, that's the story. Here's a little bit of background before we now go and break that down, okay? The Honi the circle drawer or circle maker, there's one story that comes before this that's good to know a little bit of context for. The people are wanting water, and there's no rain coming. So Honi decides to draw a circle and stand inside, and he's not going to leave until rain falls. And he prays for rain, and it's a story, and I can send it to you if you want to reach out to me. I can send you the story. He prays for rain, and finally, in a few versions, first the rain doesn't come enough, then it comes too much, and then he asks the rain to stop. And people are enamored and thankful for this rain that he was able to bring with his prayers. Okay, so that's what happened right before this story. And so the beginning of what we're looking at is basically the rabbis trying to explain through a verse from Job why was Honi so special? What made him so special that he was the one who was able to bring the rain during a drought to these people? And then it shifts to the second part of this idea of him meeting this man with the carob tree and him dreaming and everything that comes after that. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background. I didn't feel that it was so necessary to look at the story that comes before it. And actually, if you, as we read through this, you may have recognized this story. It's used, rabbis tend to use it a lot, this idea of planting the tree and not necessarily being around for its fruit to come to literally fruition. So we're going to break it down, though, in a little bit more specificity than just that general claim. Okay, so now we'll go back. Keep in mind as we go through this, what are we supposed to learn about Honi? What do you learn about Honi through the story? And what is the connection to your life, to our lives today? And what are the themes and what are the teachings that the rabbis are trying to teach us about Honi, about the situation, what's going on here? Okay, and then we'll have a discussion and afterwards. All right, so back to the beginning. So our rabbis have taught, what message did the members of the superior court send to Honi? So once he was able to bring this rain to everyone, what did they say to him? And they quote Job. Now, this section of Job is one of Job's friends talking to him, and Job's friends, as Job is going through all of these hardships in his life and losing everything around him, the friends tend to be the ones who say he should remain faithful and he should hold on to a more traditional theodicy of how the world works. And so they quote, and then they're going to break down that quote into pieces and connect it. And this is a thing that happens throughout the Talmud, where they quote a text and then they link it to this certain character or whatever's happening in the story. Okay, so the quote is, "You shall also decree something, and it shall be established for you, and light shall shine upon your ways. When they cast you down, you shall say there is a lifting up for the humble person he saves," meaning God. "God delivers him that is not innocent. Yes, he shall be delivered through the cleanness of your hands." So this optimistic look at, even though there's a lot of bad things happening, have faith and you shall be lifted up by God. So now they break it down. "You shall also decree something." So now they're going to, piece by piece, they're going to explain why Honi is the way he is and why he was successful. And we're not going to spend a ton of time on this. I want to focus more on the page 2. "You have decreed below, and the Holy One, blessed be he, carries out your word above." So Honi prayed and God answered that prayer. "A light shall shine upon your ways. In a generation that is shrouded in darkness, did you illuminate through your prayer." So a time and in a generation where there was darkness all around, you were the type of leader that within that darkness, you were able to bring light to that generation through your prayer. So now we're getting the sense that Honi is seen as a leader, right? He is a leader that in a time of darkness, we can imagine we are in a time of darkness, and this is, of course, not the only time of darkness that has existed. There are so many moments in the world's history of darkness, so we are in one of those now. So in a generation that is shrouded in darkness, you illuminated through your prayer. So there was something special about Honi as a leader and some efficacy in his prayer that allowed him to bring light to that generation. "When they cast you down, you shall say there is a lifting up. That a generation that had sunk down, you lifted up with your prayer." Again, in a moment where people are feeling just broken, feeling pessimistic about what's going on, are feeling as though there is no light at the end of the tunnel, you were able to bring them and lift them up. Okay, again, this is another theme that I think we're dealing with right now in our own lives, this feeling of being sunk down. And we are all, of course, looking for those leaders and moments where we can feel lifted up. "For the humble person he saves, a generation that was humiliated by its sin, you saved by your prayer." So again, in the traditional idea that your sin leads to pain or suffering, that in a time where people were sinning, you were able to save them with your prayer. Again, this prayer, Honi's prayer, is very significant here. "He delivers him that is not innocent. A generation that was not innocent, you delivered by your prayer." Reiterating some of the same things. "Yes, he shall be delivered through the cleanness of your hands. You delivered it through the work of your clean hands." There was a purity about Honi. Some commentators suggest that he was childlike in the way that he said, I am not going to leave this circle. You can imagine a little kid, right? I am not going to leave this circle until you let me do X, Y, or Z. So a similar idea of some who suggest that there was a childlike nature by which Honi declared this prayer to God to bring rain, the part of the story that we didn't read that comes before this, and that by standing in the circle and declaring, I am not leaving until I leave this circle, there was a childlike nature to that, right? Because we can imagine little children doing the same thing. I'm not moving from the spot X, Y, and Z, right? And again, this clean hands, is it a purity of his thought? Is it a purity of innocence of the way in which the world works? But there's something about that innocence and that purity that allowed Honi to be successful. Okay, so now we move on from that into another section about Honi. Rabbi Yochanan said, all the rest of the life of that righteous man, that's referring to Honi, he was troubled by this verse of scripture. Okay, so even though Honi went through all these amazing things and was able to bring rain to this community, there was a piece of text that always bothered him. And that was the beginning of Psalm 126, a song of ascents, as many psalms begin. When the Lord brought back those that returned to Zion, we were like those who dream. He was troubled by this. So why would he be troubled by this? So this is referring to the idea of returning from exile, right? Once the Jews were kicked out of the land of Israel, when they came back, and this idea of returning to Zion as time of redemption after being in exile, we were like those who dream. Now, what's interesting is that Honi, you think, well, okay, what's troubling him about that? He thought, is there anyone who sleeps and dreams for 70 years? Okay, so what he's focusing on here right now is this idea of sleeping and dreaming. And he comes up with 70 years. Some make this idea the reference to the amount of time that the Jews were in exile. But really this idea that his focus is on that last word about dreams. Okay, so again, right now we have this moment, and one theme that is clearly coming up here is the idea of dreams. And what is the role of dreaming when you are in exile or when you are redeemed? Okay, and this on its surface is referring to the exile of the Jewish people and then them returning, and that they, even when they returned, they were like those who dreamed, right? We can imagine that this is the idea that when you are in exile, you have this opportunity to dream really big. When you are not where you want to be, dreams different than nightmares, dreams can serve as your key to redemption. That when we are in a moment of exile, not just, of course, now I'm expanding it beyond physical exile. It's not just when we are no longer physically where we want to be, where we need to be, where we feel safe, but when we are feeling as though we are in an exilic state, when we are not where we are supposed to be, that dreams can serve as that gateway to a feeling of redemption, right? And not just dreams and when we're sleeping, but I'm really thinking about this is a really important lesson about the value of our dreams of what redemption can look like for ourselves and for our society. Okay, but Honi here is focusing on this idea of the dreaming and literal sleep. And can someone actually sleep for 70 years? It seems like a pretty innocent question. And it's interesting that that's always been bothering him. Okay, so let's see what happens. One day he was going along the road and he saw a man who was planting a carob tree. Again, we've seen a few times where there have been carob trees. And he said to this man, we don't know who this man is, he's anonymous, as to that tree, how long does it take to bear fruit? And the man says it takes 70 years. And so Honi says to him, you realize that is it absolutely obvious to you that you are going to live another 70 years? And the man says, that man I found a world full of carobs. So just as my fathers planted for me, so I plant these for my children. In other words, I'm not focusing on whether or not I am going to benefit from the fruit of this tree, but people planted carobs for me to benefit from, and now I am planting trees and the carobs for my children to benefit from, right? And you can see why this is a great story to be used in all kinds of settings, right? Here is and a lot of times the story ends right here, right? Because what we're talking about is this idea that what you plant, you are planting not necessarily for the benefit of yourself, but how important it is, and the important lesson in our tradition that there are many things that we are not going to be able to accomplish in our own life, but we have a responsibility to be planting those seeds of justice, of love, of hope, of opportunity for the next generation. And that we are not a tradition that focuses purely on the ego and purely on the self, but that we have to remove ourselves from that focus and be able to look beyond ourselves, beyond our own lifetime, right? That's why there are so many Jews who give to causes, and to do so in a way that will carry on not just their memory after they die, but to help perpetuate the Jewish people, right? And it comes, that concept is very much right here in this story, this idea that we have a responsibility to the next generation, what we do, and how hard it is in our society to be able to be focused this way, because we're so much about the moment and right now and immediacy, and what does this do for me, and how am I going to benefit, or even how is my family who's alive right now going to benefit, right? But this is why when we think about our own lives and how we want to establish a will or an ethical will, or how important it is for anyone at a certain age, probably even starting at my age, let's be honest, to be really thinking about what is it that you want to leave, not just financially for your children and your grandchildren. That is very important. How do you set yourself up for that? But also, are there things that you want to pass down ethically, values? Maybe you should take the time, if you haven't already, to write those down, right? What do you want to make sure when you are no longer alive, that your children and grandchildren are aware of, that are values that are important to you, that you want them to continue on in your name, in your legacy? One of the questions that I always ask families when I am preparing for a funeral is I ask them, what is it about this person? What values or teachings do you want to continue and hold on to now that they've passed away? What is it that you are taking from their life experience and what mattered to them with you, and how are you living that out in your own life? And that is something we all should be thinking about, and not only now, but so that we can prepare for the future where we are not going to be around. Okay, so he sat down. So now Honi, he realizes this man is, he doesn't say anything else in return. He says, okay, I get it. He sat down to wrap a piece of bread, and all of a sudden sleep overtakes Honi. And as he slept, a rocky formation closed around him and hid him from sight, and he slept for 70 years. Okay, I want to, right before we go to the next line, one of the interesting interpretations that I found about this section is this idea of this rocky formation closed around him. There's another very important leader in our history, the Jewish people in the Torah, who when he comes into contact with God, God says to him, you cannot see my face. You go hide in the cleft of the rock, and you will see me pass by, right? And that's Moses, and it's his encounter with God, where he wants to see God, and he can only see a piece of God, but he is brought into the cleft of the rock, right? So he's surrounded by this rocky formation. So maybe this is a clear connection that the rabbis are trying to draw, or it was just this other interpretation that this rabbi, this scholar, came up with. But I like it. I like this parallel between Moses and Honi, two leaders for their time, given what we had just read earlier on in this passage about how Honi's prayer had a way in which he was able to draw people out of the darkness and bring hope to them in that time that they were in a place of despair. So too, Moses was a leader who took people from exile towards the land of redemption, right? He was so there is, I think, a connection here. And so he was hidden. Again, we've also seen this idea of hiddenness throughout many stories, especially those about the cave. What does it mean to go off and to be completely secluded from the world? And he slept for 70 years. And when he woke up, he saw a certain man gathering carobs from that same tree that he had just seen right before he fell asleep. This is totally like a futuristic, it's like he's going into the future, very Back to the Future kind of thing. He said to him, "Are you the one who planted the tree?" Because he doesn't know how long he's been sleeping. And he said to him, "I am his grandson." And he said to him, "Is it to be inferred that I have slept for 70 years? And he saw his ass, who had produced generations of mules, and he went home. So he decides that he has to go home. Now he realizes he's been sleeping for a long time. Now you have to imagine, it's like a great sci-fi movie. What would it be to fall asleep and to wake up 70 years from now, and to to go out and how would you understand the world? What is your place in the world when the world has changed? And the way I'm thinking about this in our own lives today is we have been in our homes, in our rocky formations, and the world is changing. And now we're not blind to the ways in which the world is changing. And I would say the ways in which the world is still staying the same. But there is a transition happening. And how we are going to emerge and deal with that is a theme that we've come back to a lot in these sessions. So he goes out, he's slept for 70 years. And so he goes and he asks, is the son of Honi the circle jar still alive? Now he wants to know about his own family. And they said to him, his son is no longer, but his grandson is here. No one knows. He is now a completely anonymous person, even though he had been a leader and someone well respected in his own life. Now, 70 years later, no one even knows who he is at this point. He's gone back to his family, back to his home. They don't even recognize him. And his son is no longer alive, and now it's his grandson. And he said to them, I am Honi the circle jar. And they didn't believe him, right? Because he'd been gone for so long. And who is this guy? So he went to the house of study. And he heard the rabbis saying, our traditions are as clear to us as in the days of Honi the circle jar. For when he would come to the house of study, any question that the rabbis had, he would work out for them. So now he is hearing that the rabbis are referring to him as if he was a part of history. He is no longer a presence in the reality, in the today. He is now someone from the past that they draw memory from him, but now he's actually standing there. So you have to try and imagine, what would it be like in your own life if all of a sudden you were to wake up and people were talking about you as though, and carrying on your legacy, so to speak, but you were to kind of sit back and watch that. There's another great story about that in the Talmud, which maybe we'll look at. It has a very disturbing ending, but it's a great story that's also about Moses. I think it's Moses who goes to the back of the Beit Midrash, and he hears all about the studying that's going on, and people are talking about how wonderful he was, and he's sitting there watching. And so I'll have to remember to try and bring that story to us because it's a great one. He said to them, I am Honi the circle jar. And they didn't believe him or pay him any respect such as was owing to him. And he was deeply hurt, and he sought mercy, and he died. So here it is, this man who this I think is really tapping into this idea of how do we find the value of what we add to the world, and our identity and our name and who we are, and what does that mean when that doesn't seem relevant anymore? That is a death, right? It's almost as though that would feel like a death, even though they're still referring to him, but there's something as though his relevance is no longer the same as it used to be. And I think that's one of the greatest fears that we all have, right? The fear of what does it mean to be relevant, and after I die, what is going to be my legacy? One of the ideas is that we continue to live on as long as people are saying our name, but as soon as no one is saying our name anymore, that's true death. That's when we really die. And so the importance of memory in our tradition of saying the names of people who have passed away, of continuing their legacy, of sharing the stories of who they were and what they did in their lives, is a way of keeping them alive, right? And as soon as there are no more stories told about us, then we are truly gone. So, and then it ends with, that is in line with what people say, either fellowship or death. A really interesting ending, right? So here we have this idea of Honi. He's no longer recognized for his value in the present. He was something of the past. He's no longer a leader of the community. They don't even recognize him anymore. And that is in line with what people say, either fellowship or death. This connection, I still struggle with this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this final line, what this is suggesting, because I'm always curious, when you all have wonderful interpretations, that there is something about relationships and about fellowship, and as soon as while you have relationships, I think it's connected from what I was just saying about the line before. When there is a relationship that exists between you and people, even after you're gone, then you remain truly still alive, and you are connected relationally to others. But as soon as none of those relationships exist, then that is true death. So that's one interpretation. I think there is something here about leadership. I think the idea that you are leaders and that many people are leaders for a certain time in history and for a certain moment. And then that time, when that time is no longer the same, you're no longer a leader for that, for the next phase of that group's journey or that country's history. That what does it mean to be okay and secure with being a leader for who you are in the time that you are leading, and that there is going to be a time where you're no longer the same type of leader, or your leadership style doesn't work for the setting which exists right now. And that can be very hard for someone who has known and has been supported as a leader, however you want to define leader, for a certain period of time, and it was working. And now all of a sudden, it no longer works, and you're no longer relevant in the same way. And that is very painful. That is a very painful process. Anyone who's felt as though their relevance is no longer there in a group or in a company, whatever it may be, right? That can be very troubling. So I think this is also reminding us of that struggle. And again, this idea of exile and redemption, and that all of this came about. This whole story was about this one line from Psalms about this idea of coming back from exile and the role of dreaming. And let's be honest, we're all in exile. We are constantly in a state of exile. We are always looking for finding a state of redemption, of being redeemed, excuse me. And we're never really fully there, right? That is part of our journey in life, is to go from a place of feeling as though there are certain things missing, that we're not purely at the promised land yet. And that one of the incredible journeys of our life is to try and get as close as possible. Because if you remember, Moses doesn't even get to the land of Israel. He guides people, and his leadership was to help people, guide them through exile towards redemption. His job was not to be the leader once they got into that promised land. That required a different type of leader, right? And so how do we understand what it means if all of us are going through a process of being in exile? And we all need to be thinking about, what are the dreams that we have for ourselves, for our family, for our society? And how can we hold on to those dreams? How can we try and enact some of those dreams to draw a little bit closer to redemption, recognizing that we may not get exactly where we want to be at the end of the road, but that being in a state of dreaming is a really important thing to do, right? And I think it's linked in our tradition to this idea of hope, of tikva, right? Dreaming is a way in which we imagine how things can be different. And then it's our responsibility to take those dreams and act on them. So we don't just leave them in a dream state, but since we are a tradition of action and not just thought, how are you going to act on that? What are you going to do to potentially have your dream become a reality? And I think our tradition in this story is saying your dreams can become a reality, and yet you also have to recognize there are limitations to what you are going to be able to accomplish, and that there is going to be a moment, as hard and painful as it is, to know that your relevance shifts. Not that we become irrelevant, but that our relevance shifts, and that our role shifts throughout our lives. And that also, on top of that, we have a role even after we die. And we need to be thinking now about the role we want to play once we are gone, and how we can maintain that sense of fellowship that exists. What are the relationships that you are building, that you've been building in your life thus far, and the relationships that either you need to fix, you need to maintain, or new relationships that you need to create in order to maintain a sense of fellowship even after you die? Which may seem a little weird, but I'm thinking about it, the more relationships we have, the longer our legacy can be continued before we truly die, when no one is telling stories about us, no one is knowing what mattered to us, the role we played. That, I think, is something very scary. It scares me to think about, what does it mean when I'm no longer going to be relevant in the world? And for me, that's a motivating factor to try and do whatever I can while I'm here. But it's also a very scary thing, and I think there's a recognition of that in the story itself. Okay, so those are some of my thoughts. And so I'd love at this point to turn it to all of you, and anyone who wants to share any questions, comments, reflections on the story about Honi or any of the themes that we brought up: exile, redemption, dreaming, rain, droughts, any of that. I see Sukasa has a question, or a comment. So go ahead, Sukasa.
Yeah, my question is, the second to last sentence where Honi wants mercy.
Yeah.
And he sought mercy, and I guess he didn't get it, so he died. I don't understand that. I'm curious what other people think it means. He was hurt that people didn't remember him. But
yeah.
They use the word mercy.
I think it's, how do you find, I would read it as a sense of peace at the end. How can you, he sought the sense of, how can I have a sense of peace with the fact that I am no longer recognized the way I used to be? And how can I deal with that? Is there a way in which,
so it's mercy?
There can be some...
He wanted mercy for himself. He wanted comfort for himself. It wasn't that he wanted mercy from others.
That's how I read it. That's,
okay.
Yes, correct. And it's interesting also, thank you for the question, Sukasa. It's also interesting because earlier God responded to his prayers right away. He was the one who was able to bring rain, and here his life is not extended, right? He extended because he was sleeping for 70 years. That's pretty amazing by itself. But here, even the relationship with God has shifted. And God plays a different role. And I think that's another important lesson, that our relationship with God continues to develop and change. And we may feel a certain way in terms of our connection to God at one point, and it may feel different given what we go through. This is all pretty obvious, I know, but it's nice to sometimes reiterate it, that there are times where that relationship is going to change, and that is a part of the Jewish experience of our relationship with God, and that's not a bad thing, but that is the way in which our relationship with God exists. It's not the same throughout our entire life. Carol. Hi, Carol.
I was just wondering if this is totally applicable to today's situations that we're all facing. I believe it is, but I wish you could expand on the explanation.
Well, how do you think it's connected to what we're going through today?
Well, I think it's a story. It's a story. It seems to be very valid in its context, but I wonder if we can take a lesson to contemporary life that we could share with the entire world.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Carol. Well, I think this idea of feeling as though we are in exile is something that is relevant for our lives today, in the sense that exile is a time in which you feel cast out from your place of peace, of a sense of home, a sense of security. And while we're in our homes, we're living in a world that is a constant state of exile, where we are not feeling safe. We are being attacked by a virus that we can't see, that's invisible, that is destructive. And its destruction is not just physical on those who get coronavirus, but also has an impact, of course, on the families of those people, but our entire society, on the economics of our society. Also, we are in exile in the sense that there is still residual effects of slavery in this country, and that we are finally understanding that if the Jewish experience of going from Egypt to the land of Israel was the beginning and the best story of what it means to go from slavery to freedom, then in this country, especially as we think about this weekend, 4th of July, we are still going through a process of being in exile and trying to find a way to redeem ourselves from a history in this country that has led to inequality and continues to cause problems within our society that do not allow equal access and equal opportunity to all the members of this society and members of our country. right? So that, again, is another exile where if we think about the role of dreaming, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. is famous for the I Have a Dream speech, right? Dreams are a way in which we start to articulate an idea of change. And then we take those dreams and we take the words and our understandings of what those dreams can be, and we try and figure out a way to act on them. And so I think we're in a time, whether it's COVID-19, whether it's systemic injustice and racial injustice, whether it's the economic challenges that we're facing, unemployment, I mean, all kinds of things, the healthcare system, the election that's going to be coming up in November, I could go on and on. And that's just in our country. I mean, think about what's happening in Hong Kong, this rule that China just laid out a couple of days ago, right? There are lots of things happening around the world. And of course, Yemen, which we never talk about, but that's been going through hell for years and years. There are many moments and many things going on in our world right now that give us a sense of exile. And we have a responsibility to dream, to write down those dreams, to articulate those dreams, not just to ourselves, but to speak about our dreams, and then figure out, what am I going to do about that dream? And how can I try and bring that dream to a reality? So I think for me, that's the biggest connection that I'm taking from the story to the world in which we're living today. Thank you, Carol. Gary. Sorry, Gary. Go ahead, Gary.
Unmute. I'm unmuted.
You are unmuted.
I'm live and in color today, and you got my picture up instead. Oh well. It's probably my fault. 2 points I probably want to make. Going back to Steve Brewer, who was camp director, executive director at Wilshire for years, the one thing he taught us when we were counselors was you never know when you touch a child's life, and that you should act every day as if you're doing something important. And I think that when you look at the story of planting the tree for the future, and I've heard this story before, you realize that we're always working in some way that will contribute to the future of other people. As some of you may know, I was executive director at a major synagogue in San Francisco for 17 years. And how many people's lives we touched in that period of time? Families that went through transitions, people that went through b'nai mitzvah, whatever it might have been. And you never knew when you were going to impact someone. And then you find out years later that someone says, oh, remember when you did that for me? And you have no idea you did it because you don't remember it, but they remember it, So that's the point I wanted to make.
Thank you, Gary. Do you mind sharing which synagogue you were an executive
I was at
director?
Emmanuel in San Francisco.
Oh, small place.
Yes, it's very small.
Great. Thank you, Gary. Okay, Merle. Hi, Merle.
Hi. So I was just thinking, when you talked about ego and thinking of yourself, which is ego, and how, you want a legacy. So if your ego is really over-egoed, so to speak, people get tired of you. But I think of and this goes along with what Gary just said. I think of all of what Brewer taught us when we were, growing up and becoming staff and administrators at camp. But even more than that, I think about the legacy that we've left for camp, that my parents left for camp, and now having our daughter, and now who also is at camp for part of summer as well. But now our grandchildren look at camp as something that their great-grandparents and us have left them. That, when they ask, well, why did you do this, that, and the other thing, our comment is we're leaving it for you and for other kids. And I take it out of the realm of what's going on today, because my hope is that what's going on in the world today will hopefully improve at some point soon. And not that we'll ever go back to what was normal. I don't know. We don't know. But I do think that I need to keep it in my own head and in my family's head is what got us where we are today. And hopefully that will, I think of my mother would say, don't look at how bad it is now, look at what you can do for the future. And that's what I get out of this story.
Great. I love that optimistic approach. And I think it's a very Jewish approach. And it's a real gift if you think about what you're giving to the next generation with camp, and any way in which you are seeing that your responsibility and your roles now is for a future time when you're not even going to be around is I think one of the best gifts that we can give in our lives. So thank you, Merle. Speaking about ego, I saw that Allison had wrote, isn't it also about ego and consciousness? Honi's ego is hurt because they didn't pay him respect they thought he was owed. Is it not a lesson about being humble and doing because it is right, not because you need to be validated? Yeah, great point, Allison. And yes, I think you're right. There is an element to this about this ego. And if you think about people who have at one point or another had value based on their position, their title, their name, whatever it may be in whatever setting, of course his ego is hurt. And that, if, as you point out, the lesson about being humble, that similarly, right, the humility of the man who planted that tree, knowing that he wasn't going to benefit from the fruits of that tree, is a complete sign of humility, right? So what Honi misses, and what I think we see in his development as a character, is that he has been puffed up, right? And think about chametz, I think about puffed up, I think about chametz, which we're not supposed to eat during Pesach. And one of the teachings about chametz is that it's the things that puff us up. It's about the ego, and that we're supposed to remove all of those things during Pesach. So that's why we don't eat chametz, is because we are supposed to remove the ego from our experience, that in order to move from slavery to redemption, you have to not be enslaved by your own ego, and that you have to move into a place of humility. You have to move into a place that it's not about you at the center, right? And Honi was literally at the center of the circle. His name is about being at the center of the circle. And one of the very important lessons that he's learning throughout his journey in his life is that he isn't at the center of that circle. And that if he thinks he's at the center, he's got it all wrong. That really, the way to really be a part of the world is not to put yourself at the center of the circle, but to realize that you are just one little piece of a much broader picture, and that you do have a circle of responsibility, but you do not stand at the center of the world, of the circle of world. So Allison, I hope that helps you a little with what you brought up. Thank you for that. Susan. Hi, Susan.
Unmute. I have a few things. One, I think Merle's statement was very good, and I feel the same way. And in what ways, when we come out of this, to improve, and healthcare is certainly high on the list. Then also a caveat. I often do caveats, but you were talking a lot about ego. And years ago, I read some original Freud, and ego is is necessary. It's an organizing principle. It's when you become, and the superego, when you become too self-focused, that's detrimental. But there are all of these statements now by media people saying, I now love myself, and that might be excessive also. But there is a point where a loss of ego can also lead to death. And what struck me here, which no one has brought up, is that Honi was old. And is this the way old people are treated? What about ageism? He feels irrelevant. He has trouble with the younger people even noticing that he exists, or establishing relationships. So it's either fellowship or death. There's trouble with that. When he's 70, he may have been 90 now. I don't know we don't know how old he was in the beginning. But what about that?
Excellent point. Thank you for bringing that up, Susan. I think that's a really important thing that we need to be thinking about. I know there are Jewish organizations and partnerships, I know here in LA and other parts of the country, that are, and even at Wilshire with the new building that we're putting up, that the Annenberg Foundation is going to have an entire floor dedicated to doing teaching and community building for those who are older. And so I think our society also needs, not just on the healthcare front, as you were saying, but also what is that? We have more and more people who are getting older and living longer, and where retirement at 65 still leaves you with an entire career potential after that, right? And we can't neglect the fact that that is an entire lifetime that people have to be doing good work, right? And to be still effective, and that we have to get away from that ageism and the idea that someone who is older, however we want to define that these days, has a capacity and capability and knowledge that we have to tap into in the society if we want to continue to improve it. And so I don't have the answer per se, but I think what you're bringing up is a really important acknowledgement that we can't forget that, and that this is, you're right, another story about the challenge as people get older. How do we make sure they are still seen and heard and remain relevant, because they are relevant. Everyone still has that relevance, right? And potentially even more so, the more of life that you've lived, the more you've seen, to be able to use that knowledge to benefit all of us, including me as a younger person, and how can we tap into that? So I really appreciate you bringing that up, Susan. Thank you. Let's see, I think Allison said, isn't there a Jewish phrase also about no more than my place, but no less than my space, about how you see no one as superior to you nor inferior? I don't know that one, but Allison, if you find the reference, please email me at rabbijoel@wbtla.org. So I'd like to hear that. Okay, well, one more thing. Oh, Jody's just wondering why rabbis so love Honi the circle maker. I think it's one of those easy stories. It's an easy story to go to. It's short, it's brief, and every rabbi knows that if you go too long, people fall asleep. Just like Honi, who slept for 70 years. You know, you don't want the synagogue to be, you don't want to look out there and see that everyone is Honi the circle maker sleeping through the whole service, right? So one of the ways to do that is to find a short, brief story that can pack a punch really quickly and can teach a lesson. And in this case, this story teaches one of those central Jewish values of legacy. So you can use it for development and fundraising purposes. You can use it for thinking about what is your value and what you want to pass on, and the idea of education, and the idea of the tree of planting roots, and recognizing that we have limitations to what we may be able to do, but that there's a hopeful idea of what the future can bring, right? The fruits of that tree, even when we're not around, we have a responsibility, just like the phrase, you know, you are not free to refrain from doing the work, even if you're not going to complete it, right? You still have to be doing the work. And so this is another example of that. So I think rabbis, it's probably been used too much because many of you have probably heard it. And so, you know, that's another one of the very, very small reasons why I am enjoying this is I'm getting a whole new cohort of stories that I can be tapping into. So so that we're not just stuck with Honi, but it is a great story, and it's a good reason why we use it over and over again. But now you guys have a larger context of what Honi is and his life. So I think with that, we are going to wrap up for today. Thank you all for joining me. I hope you have a safe 4th of July weekend. No one's, at least here in LA, going to be going out and seeing fireworks, so at least you can enjoy the fireworks on your TV screen. And we'll be bringing, Cantor Lisa Picot and I put together a Shabbat service that we're streaming tomorrow at 6 p.m. And we tried to use some drone footage and do some filming in different parts of the city. So that should be interesting, and be curious if you watch it, your thoughts and reflections on that service as well. But wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom, a happy 4th of July, and may you continue to dream big and remain relevant. And may we all kind of plant those trees for the next generation for sure. So thank you all very much, and look forward to learning with you next week.